Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. The first debate in the U.S. presidential rematch sees Joe Biden and Donald Trump trade barbs on the economy, foreign policy, and their fitness for office.
This guy's 3 years younger and a lot less competent.
Well, I took 2 tests, cognitive tests. I aced them. I just won 2 club championships.
Iran goes to the polls to elect a new president after the death of Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. Voting opens in 30 minutes. And European leaders nominate Ursula von der Leyen for a second term as president of the European Commission. We're live to Brussels later this hour. Well, good morning again, everybody. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. A lot to digest throughout the course of the next hour. And of course, we're going to be talking a lot about that presidential debate that took place just about over an hour ago between Presidents Trump and Biden. We'll bring you some of the highlights from that. But interesting to see the market reaction. And as you can see from behind me, both futures for S&P and Nasdaq are leaning into the green. So you could say that perhaps shrugging off some of the highlights of the discussions that took place, or perhaps in anticipation of the big event from a macroeconomic perspective today, and that is PCE. I'll just get to that in a moment. I also want to draw your attention to 10-year yields sitting at around 4.31%. We've moved a couple of basis points higher over the course of the last couple of hours. You could put it down to some of the topics that came out through the debates, and of course a lot of focus on economic plans, fiscal profligacy, what those extension or potential extension of tax cuts could mean for the U.S. fiscal deficit looking ahead. That has pushed some of these yields higher. We will talk more about that on the show. And then the USD continues to trade very strongly. It has been on an upswing for the last couple of weeks, the USD, and having ramifications, as we've spoken about a lot this week, on other currency pairs like the yen. As for PCE today, we are expecting the numbers to drop from the last month. The headline number is expected to cool to around 2.6%. And here you can see that the trend month on month has been drifting lower throughout the course of this year. No doubt that would be welcome data for the Fed to parse through and also set the stage for that eventual rate cut. The market is pricing in around 45 basis points of rate cuts by the end of this year. But back to our main story of the day. Joe Biden and Donald Trump have sparred on the economy, the Middle East, and over their character and fitness for office in their televised presidential campaign debate. The president stumbled through some exchanges as Trump went on the offensive.
He said the only one who wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
President Biden, you have a minute.
I've never heard so much foolishness. This is a guy who wants to get out of NATO. Are you going to stay in NATO? He's going to pull out of NATO. The idea that we have our strength lies in our alliances as well.
So for more on this, let's bring in Bloomberg's Markets Today anchor Kriti Gupta, who joins me now from London. Kriti, as we spoke about yesterday, they had introduced a specific format for how the debate was going to go, including silencing of mics, a strict time constraint for each candidate to speak. But we also spoke about the fact that this was going to be a debate where people were going to focus primarily on personality and the physical presence of these candidates over some of the policy measures that they were going to be talking about. What is your assessment of what we got from this presidential debate just over an hour ago?
Yeah, a test of endurance for both candidates, both for former President Trump and for President Biden. Remember, the debate circumstances really tried to address some of the issues you've seen in past debates, really address interrupting, which was, of course, a feature of the 2020 debate by President Trump and President Biden as well. You saw moments of that as well, but CNN really decided to use muted microphones as a way of tackling that. They also talked about both candidates having to stand at their podiums for 90 minutes, no time for debate or consulting with their debate teams and their campaign teams. It also only included 2 commercial breaks and only 1 minute, about 1 minute, sometimes 2-minute answers, but mostly about 60 seconds for them to respond to criticisms from each other. Interruptions, follow-up questions, even real-time fact-checking were all put into pushed aside, I should say, for this certain debate. Again, really to emphasize the fact that these are 2 candidates that need to be engaging in a civil discourse. At least that was the goal from CNN's perspective. When in terms of the actual result, it seems like Joe Biden has been viewed as not doing so well. The questions of his health only emphasized after he stumbled several times, had kind of a raspy voice as well. coming out of the debate, the Democratic Party certainly concerns.
Definitely playing into concerns over his age there. In terms of the topics that were discussed, it was wide-ranging. They had moments to talk about immigration, big topic in the U.S., obviously abortion, but also the state of the economy, because many Americans have been concerned about high levels of inflation, cost of living. And I do wonder if we gleaned anything new from an economic perspective looking ahead, and whether they also address that big question of what to do with the U.S. fiscal deficits.
Well, Juman, it's the very first thing on the new president's docket, regardless of who enters the Oval Office in January of 2025. So the question is, how do they actually close that gap? Two candidates, two completely different policy approaches. Let me just walk you through some of what they actually talked about in terms of their approach. I'll start with President Biden, specifically talking about tax hikes on the wealthy, saying if you make over $400,000, he expects you to have to pay even more on their tax. And that's something that's going to help fund some of the deficit. He's also talking about more long-term plans, even more chip investment, even more tackling on drug pricing, things that he says are going to add billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of benefit when it comes to closing that gap. That is President Biden's economic agenda, or parts of it at least. President Trump taking a little bit of a different approach. He's talking about tax cuts and really emphasizing that as a way to get multiple corporations, like Apple, for example, is one that he named, in terms of repatriating some of the money that is being held abroad. Remember, this was a kind of pillar of his former policy as well. He's talking about investing in oil and gas. He's talking about potentially pulling out of NATO and pulling back on the spending there. And of course, the big one, tariffs, in terms of helping funding that deficit.
Yeah, and that deficit is 6%. So it is substantial. Kriti, thank you so much for the overview. That was Bloomberg's Markets Today anchor, Kriti Gupta. Let's bring in Ryan Lemand, the CEO and co-founder at Neovision Wealth Management. Ryan, good to have you on. Let me just straight out ask you, as a market participant, how do you view the presidential debate that just took place now?
I didn't watch the whole debate. I watched snippets of it and some very specific snippets. Agnostic to politics and sides, my assessment is that Trump has won the debate clearly. So President Biden, he had moments of absence, stuttered a bit, he had to check his notes. So if I had to assess on a pure performance, agnostic to politics, President Trump seemed much more forceful and present in the debate.
Do you think that markets are being too complacent about what could happen in the next 4 years, should perhaps President Biden be reelected, or even President Trump himself? Both of them are slightly older in age. Should markets be pricing in for the possibility of perhaps a change of presidential candidates, or even a change in president once the term has begun?
So you're absolutely right. Markets are not pricing this specific point, but also not pricing the fact that both of them have economic and financial policies that would be detrimental to the United States today. One of them is increasing deficit, not increasing taxes, spending, stopping immigration, hence increasing unemployment. And the other is the opposite. Both of these are bad economically and financially for the U.S.
So this sounds to me, if we go along that route of renationalization, putting up barriers, introducing tariffs, all of that sounds inflationary to me.
100%.
How problematic is that going to be for Fed, who are clearly very keen to get going on the rate-cutting cycle?
That's precisely it. The Fed today is cornered, and that's why the Fed is not cutting rates, because on one side you have fiscal spending that is massive, which is creating the multiplier effect. As you know, government spending of $1 translates into $5 in the economy. Hence, the Fed today cannot cut rates. Second, as you rightly mentioned, if we get into that scenario, then the Fed cannot cut. And that is why today the Fed is one of the last central banks in the developed world who hasn't cut rates yet.
Do you think there's any calculus at all? I mean, I know at the last meeting, Powell was specifically asked about this and whether they're thinking about the elections and the timing of the first rate cut. He said we're completely independent. But do you think there is an element of the Fed wanting to start cutting before the election takes place?
So, Jemana, we always say the Fed is independent, but we have seen historically that the Fed is always influenced by politics. Our assessment is that the Fed will avoid cutting rates before the elections because it might be misinterpreted massively. So I think the Fed would prefer a status quo until after the elections and then act on it depending on which president comes on board.
Right, even though there are 2 rate cuts penciled in. Let's turn to the equities performance. You put in one of your notes, and I think it's it's a fairly valid point that the market has completely given up on anything related to the macroeconomic cycle. The theme that we talk about day in, day out is AI, 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 or mostly NVIDIA. If NVIDIA pulls back, then the market gets scared. But when NVIDIA is having a good run, it seems to lift up the rest of the market as well. How long can we continue in this paradigm for?
Oh, it can continue as long as it wants, as long as money is flowing and there's liquidity in the system. I called it a one-legged market, and we don't invest into one-legged market. You discuss often with your guests and compare to year 2000, right? Just the fact of comparing it to year 2000 means we are in an overvaluation territory and a bubble territory. We do not invest client institutional money into bubble territory, period. This can continue long enough. People can make a lot of money or lose a lot of money. Don't your clients worry that they're missing out on the run, though? If you're not invested in AI and you're not invested in NVIDIA, aren't they saying to you, well, look, we're missing out. We're underperforming the market here? Wealthy clients are concerned by wealth preservation rather than chasing these 10, 15%. This is more retail. And if you look, the retail portion today in U.S. markets is massive compared to historicals. And this is what's driving it. Go on Reddit. Just look at what retail clients are talking about. It's a retail market today driven by retail, and institutions are sellers. Through funds, you have indirect investments from retail as well. So we estimate around 60% of what we're seeing today is driven by retail. Interesting. Ryan, going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, giving us your views. Great to have you on, as ever. Ryan Lemand, the CEO and co-founder at Neovision Wealth Management. Now, polls open later today, in Iran's presidential election to select the replacement for Ibrahim Raisi, who was killed last month in a helicopter crash. Two of the most conservative candidates have stepped aside ahead of their votes, strengthening the chances of two other hardliners. Now, 4 men are in contention for the presidency, including the poll's only reformist candidate. Still ahead, 2 hardline conservative candidates pull out of Iran's presidential election, leaving 4 contenders. So we are going to preview that with Georgetown University in Qatar later this hour. But first, Israel allows some sick and wounded children to leave Gaza, marking the first medical evacuation in nearly 2 months. Details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. The war in Israel was a topic of discussion during the first U.S. presidential debate of 2024. President Biden doubled down on Washington's efforts for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Republican candidate Donald Trump criticized the Democratic Party's approach.
Number one, everyone from the United Nations Security Council straight through to the G7, to the Israelis and Netanyahu himself have endorsed the plan I put forward. Which has 3 stages to it. The first stage is trade the hostages for a ceasefire. Second phase is a ceasefire with additional conditions. The third phase is the end of the war. The only one who wants the war to continue is Hamas, number one. They're the only ones standing out. We're still pushing hard to get them to accept. In the meantime, what's happened? In Israel, we're finding that the only thing I've denied Israel was 2,000-pound bombs. They don't work very well in populated areas. They kill a lot of innocent people. We're providing Israel with all the weapons they need and when they need them.
Israel would have never been invaded in a million years by Hamas. You know why? Because Iran was broke with me. I wouldn't let anybody do business with them.
All right, there's quite a lot to pick up from that quote that we just listened to. Let's bring in Dubai Bureau Chief Dana Akhresh, who joins us now. Obviously, Israel-Gaza was going to come up in this discussion. Let's just start with Biden's remarks and the fact that he said everyone around the world, be it UN Security Council, be it European leaders, be it Israel themselves, are putting their weight behind the ceasefire, which, as we know, isn't entirely true, because earlier this week, Netanyahu gave an interview where he directly rejected that 3-point ceasefire proposal that Biden put forward. So did we learn anything new from this debate?
You're right, Jumana. And I think that when he said Hamas was the only one holding up the ceasefire agreement, you saw Trump come in and saying, no, Israel is the one doing that, and that you should let them finish the job. So Trump is saying, criticizing how Biden was handling the war and handling these negotiations, especially with the ceasefire, telling them that they should let just Israel go into Gaza and finish the job entirely. And we also saw Biden pushing back against this idea that he hasn't supported Israel fully, saying that the only thing that they have delayed or stopped shipment is, of course, the 2,000-pound bomb that we saw in this video, saying that they would cause a lot of harm to populated areas. And we saw, of course, Trump saying or criticizing Biden, also calling him a Palestinian or a bad Palestinian behaving like one. Not sure what that really meant, but of course it was a heated debate. And the Israeli-Hamas war has been a contentious issue in the U.S., right? We saw the protests, the university protests and all of that. And there is worry that Biden might lose some support because of the way that Israel had been handling the war and maybe the absence of U.S. leverage against Israel.
It's interesting that straight away off the bat, Trump brought in the Iran angle there. Of course, Iran is heading to the polls today. But there is another front that's getting increasingly worrisome. You and I have spoken about it over the course of the week, and that is the border with Lebanon. Overnight, we're hearing of Pentagon preparing themselves for the possibility of an Israeli ground attack into southern Lebanon. Yesterday, our colleagues at Bloomberg Surveillance had the chance to speak to the U.S. envoy to the region, Amos Hochstein. Let me just listen to some of his comments before we digest what this means.
Now, Hezbollah has said that they are attaching their actions to what happens in Gaza. We understand that. That's the reality. And we have to work within those parameters to see what we can do as things shift. And, of course, we are working very hard. The president has been working nonstop to try to get a ceasefire that allows all the hostages to come home and that would practically end this war in Gaza. That, of course, would make things a lot easier to reach a settlement. But it's not an automatic. It's not you get a ceasefire in Gaza and you get a ceasefire in Lebanon. It doesn't work that way. We have to have its own solution in Lebanon. But it is enabled considerably by a ceasefire in Gaza.
And earlier in that interview, he said at the end of the day, we have to get Hezbollah away from the border because the status quo of October 6 is not possible anymore, but also seemed to imply that there is a correlation between the ceasefire in Gaza and a potential ceasefire in Lebanon, but they're not one and the same.
Exactly. And Hochstein is the one pushing and handling these negotiations between Israel and directly with Hezbollah. And we have from our original reporting what the mediator between Israel and Hezbollah is, which is the House Speaker, Nabih Berri, telling Hochstein that the only thing I can ask Hezbollah is for them to reduce the tension, meaning to take these attacks back to how they were at the first days of the war, not really deep into Israel. I can ask them to reduce tensions, but obviously Hezbollah is completely rejecting withdrawing from that border, whatever kilometers they're asking or Israel is asking. And so what we're seeing now is definitely an escalation. Tensions are rising. And what you mentioned earlier, that the U.S. is sending these assets to the Mediterranean, closer to Israel and Lebanon, I think this is definitely a show of force. It's also a sign of deterrence, saying that we are here to support Israel if there is a war. And that is definitely a very strong message that everyone was waiting for. And the big question is, how would the U.S. react or support Israel if a war between the two does happen?
Yeah, very important developments to monitor. Dubai Bureau Chief Dana Khesh. Also coming up, Gulf energy giant Adnoc's deal-making ambitions are in focus. We're going to talk more about that and a special piece that we've written on the topic next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. The Gulf oil giant Adnoc is getting a dramatic makeover as it uses a $150 billion budget to become one of the world's most active energy dealmakers. This week, it took a big step in its global push by suggesting it could raise an offer for German chemicals maker Covestro to around $12.5 billion. For more on this, let's bring in Anthony DePaula, our Middle East energy markets reporter. We spoke about their revised bids upwards for Covestro, but it seems it's part and parcel of a broader strategy. They're building up their war chest.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they've got a big budget anyway. So about 18 months ago, the UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed gave them this
$150 billion 5-year budget. That's not only for acquisitions, but that goes to increasing oil and gas production. But a real part of that is looking at these new outward investments, international investments, which is a new thing for Adnoc. They had for years been basically a crude producer and seller only to Asia, effectively. Now they're branching out, looking at assets in the United States, in Africa, in Europe. The deal we're talking about now is this Covestro deal, which took a step forward earlier this week. We talked about it on the show on Tuesday when they did increase that offer and get into due diligence. Now, that deal would be the biggest international investment by a Gulf company. So we've seen lots of offers from the Gulf, but they've mainly been portfolio investors in companies getting into things like tech. Of course, we know about the sports teams, the fancy hotels. Now they're looking to be a little bit more strategic in general across the Gulf and taking up some more assets that can help the economic transitions here. But so far, we haven't seen that one big deal, that single one takeover, which would be this one. So if Adnoc does clinch this deal, that would be the biggest international investment from a Gulf company.
You raise a good point, because it's not just about getting a piece of the pie. In this case, they are buying the pie. But how does this acquisition fit into their overall strategy? Is this a part of a move to move from upstream to downstream? Is this part of it?
Yeah, they're going to continue increasing production capacity here, and they see markets for that going forward as we continue to use hydrocarbons. But they're also looking further afield in terms of things like plastics, different kinds of coatings for plastics, the things that go into our everyday items that we use, like mobile phones, like electric cars, plastic bumpers, interiors, things like that. So as we go down that transition road, they want to be ready to supply those products. So that's why they're looking into chemicals in the case of Covestro, and lots of natural gas. We've talked about those smaller deals that they've made, buying into stakes for LNG production and getting LNG supplies for themselves. So they want to get into that, moving those products around the world as well as producing them. So that's kind of the nexus of this strategy that Adnoc's following.
Excellent. Well, for viewers who want more, Anthony's piece is out on the terminal if you want to read all the details. That was Bloomberg's Middle East Energy Markets reporter Anthony DePaula. Thank you. A quick look at how markets are trading as we head into the break, and of course coming on back of that CNN presidential debate. What we are seeing is an uptick for the Nasdaq and the S&P as we head into the U.S. session. Major events coming up for market participants, of course, that is that PCE number. It is expected to drop versus where it was last month, and a big signal potentially for the Fed and what they decide to do with rate cuts into the end of the year. Other futures, you can see Eurostock futures also seen opening up in green as well. Coming up, we're going to be talking more about the Iranian presidential elections as well. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning again. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. The first debate in the U.S. presidential rematch sees Joe Biden and Donald Trump trade barbs on the economy, foreign policy, and their fitness for office.
This guy's 3 years younger and a lot less competent.
Well, I took 2 tests, cognitive tests. I aced them. I just won 2 club championships.
Iran goes to the polls to elect a new president after the death of Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. Voting opens shortly. And European leaders nominate Ursula von der Leyen for a second term as president of the European Commission. We're live to Brussels later this hour. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersetchi in Dubai. Let's get you caught up on how some of these markets are faring as we head into the U.S. session. Major event last night, of course, that presidential debate, the CNN presidential debate between President Biden and President Trump, the two trading a lot of barbs, lots of questions about President Biden's mental stamina and physical state, in addition to President Trump and the fact that he was incapable at some points of actually answering a question and answer directly. So there has been a lot of post-match analysis coming through. But as far as markets are concerned, what we're seeing is that futures are still leaning towards the green. And perhaps the major focus is actually going to be on that PCE number that comes out later today. The expectation is we are going to see a month-on-month disinflation versus where we were the prior month. So that trend continues intact. U.S. 10 years sitting at 4.31, a couple of basis points higher throughout throughout the course of the session, 2.5 basis points. So as you can see in the U.S. dollar, again, about 0.2% firmer today in the session. It continues with its strong run as we've seen in the last couple of weeks. In terms of our terminal chart today, though, it is going to be about that PCE number and the fact that the numbers are continuing with that downtrend, as I mentioned, over the course of this year. Month on month is expected to come in at 0.1%, which leads to an annualized rate of people are expecting around 2.6%, still above the 2% target that we're looking for, but does tell you that, again, the disinflationary process is continuing. But let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio standing by. And Avril, just give us an overview of how Asian markets are reacting to some of the events that have taken place over the last 24 hours, be they the U.S. data that's come through and, of course, that CNN presidential debate.
Yeah, when it comes to the debate, it's interesting how we saw that spike in the greenback. And earlier in the session, we actually saw the weakness in the Chinese currency, but it is paring some of those losses now. And for the Japanese currency, against the backdrop of that strong US dollar, it's popped above the 161 level, raising those concerns about intervention. And this weakness on the yen also comes amid the Nikkei reporting that Japan will replace its currency chief. This is part of regular personnel change. But the data, I think, is really what's top of minds for investors, not just digesting that mixed data coming out from the U.S. In terms of their personal spending, some of the jobless claims as well, but also looking ahead to the PCE print. Let's flip the board and take a look at what we're seeing in the stock market, because the Topix is at highest level in about 30 years. We haven't seen this, I think, since at least 1990, and this is fueled along by the cheapness in the Japanese currency, but also the idea that inflation is coming back in Japan. So we'll see where it finishes the day, but overall, stock market's not looking too shabby today. Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much for that overview. All right, and on to some breaking news that we've just got out of Argentina. Argentina's Congress has passed Milei's landmark economic reform by 147 to 107 votes. So it has gone through. These are bills which will look to deregulate a large chunk of the economy, boost government revenues. Of course, they were approved by the lower house in April and then very thinly, by very thin majority, passed through the Senate, and now, of course, passing through the Chamber of Deputies as well. This is a big victory for the Argentinian President Milei. He ran on a platform of shaking up the economy. He's known as a libertarian, and this is just one example of some of the legislature that President Milei is looking to get through and to help bring down that level of inflation in Argentina, which is still running very hot, close to 300%, 276%. So a victory for Argentinian President Milei. Now, Iranians will be heading to the polls today to elect their next president following the death of Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash last month. 4 men are now on the ballot after 2 of the most conservative candidates dropped out of the race yesterday. 3 of those running are anti-Western hardliners, while one candidate, Masoud Pezeshkian, is considered by some to be a reformist. Now, turnout fell to record lows in the 2 previous major Iranian elections. To talk more about this, let's bring in Luciano Zaccara, professor at Qatar University and Georgetown University in Qatar. He joins us from Buenos Aires this morning, so a very good coincidence given the news that we've just got out of Milei. But let me just start with the Iranian elections. Of course, these are snap elections that were held in response to President Raisi's death over a month ago. What are you expecting in terms of final outcome? And I guess the bigger question is, how is that going to modify Iran's foreign policy and domestic policy looking ahead if so many of these candidates are actually hardliners?
Well, actually, nobody was expecting this election to take place, so there was no preparation for that. There was no internal campaign in order to select a candidate for the future, considering that Raisi most probably would have been re-elected in 2025. Therefore, we are witnessing candidates that they are not very strong. Actually, the 2 most important candidates from the conservative camp are candidates that they already lost against reformist candidates in the previous electoral processes. Therefore, we are witnessing people that they might arrive to the power without a very strong background. in terms of foreign policy. Only Jalili has experience in negotiating the nuclear file, so maybe he would be more interested in renewing the efforts to negotiate something with the United States. But in general, I would not expect a big changes in the Iranian foreign policy. Raisi managed to get some gains during his short term, considering that several initiatives were initiated by Rouhani, Ahmadinejad, and Hatami in the past, and he was just harvesting what the other people were producing since the very beginning. So without a big change or the implementation of a unique doctrine, Raisi managed to achieve many things, mainly regarding the GCC states, reaching an agreement of normalization with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And therefore, I don't expect this trend to change in the long term.
Yeah. Well, the Americans are going to be watching these elections very closely, no least because Iran has continued along with their uranium enrichment. Depending on which sources you read, they are weeks or months away from a weapon-grade, a weapon-grade type of missile. And I just want to point out also that at one point during that CNN presidential debate yesterday, President Trump actually did bring up Iran. Let's just listen to what he had to say.
Israel would have never been invaded in a million years by Hamas. You know why? Because Iran was broke with me. I wouldn't let anybody do business with them. They ran out of money. They were broke. They had no money for Hamas. They had no money for anything. No money for terror. That's why you had no terror at all during my administration.
By the way, I'm the guy that organized the world against Iran when they had a full-blown intercontinental ballistic missile attack on Israel. No one was hurt. No one Israeli was accidentally killed, and it just stopped. We saved Israel.
Luciano, what do you think the new Iranian president is going to mean for Iranians' nuclear ambitions and the possibility of re-entering, perhaps, into talks with the U.S. about restraining some of those nuclear ambitions?
Well, I mean, Khamenei was very clear when he threatened any candidate that would restart negotiations with the United States. He has always a very clear position regarding that, even though he accepted when Rouhani signed the JCPOA. However, I don't think any of the candidates will be very open in saying that this is a real possibility, considering that they felt totally betrayed by the Trump administration, considering that any of the candidates at the end of the day in the United States are pushing for a renegotiation of the JCPOA or reducing the sanctions against Iran. I don't think any candidate would really open the door for negotiations. We know that negotiations have been conducted in Oman, both the U.S. and the Iranian administration recognize that. So the dialogue never stopped. However, it's very difficult to think that they're going to be a breakthrough in the nuclear negotiations, regardless of who is winning. Pezeshkian, in the unlikely case he is winning, he will not be able to do anything because he will be prevented to do so by the parliament and by the leader himself. And neither Jalili or Ghalibaf are in the mood for opening negotiations with the U.S. because they are not in that field, in that camp, political camp.
How closely do you think Iran is watching the developments in Lebanon? How closely are they speaking to Hezbollah about what to do vis-a-vis the border with Israel? Is there any feeling that they're distracted by the presidential elections that are taking place, or do you think that they have an active role in the decision-making of what happens in the south of Lebanon right now?
Well, Iran has always looked closely what's going on in Lebanon since the beginning of the war in October. Of course, they have been distracted for a while, but the campaign was very short. I mean, it was not very big problems in deviating a lot of attentions to the internal politics because not many expectations were created internally. Therefore, they are still focused on what is going on in Lebanon. Of course, many things were happening in the last few weeks in terms of increasing the tension between Hezbollah and Israel. It doesn't mean that Iran is actually behind the rising tension. Hezbollah has been always linked to Iran, but not always following 100% the instructions from Tehran. So I don't think that elections or this electoral process that was very, very, very fast and very quick affected in any way the relation that the IRGC mainly is having with Hezbollah along this war.
Do you see this being blown out into a full-blown war? Do you see it being escalated into a full-blown war between Israel and Lebanon?
It is likely, but all these 8 months of the war, there have been exchanges of fire between Hezbollah and Israel. More than 500 people died in Lebanon as a result of the retaliations from Israel. And however, there was no war. I mean, despite Nasrallah threatened Cyprus and other countries if they were helping Israel, I don't see very likely that Hezbollah will launch any attack to any other state actor in the region, because Hezbollah is not alone. I mean, Lebanon is formed by different political groups that they are not very happy with the increasing tension with Israel. Everybody remembers what happened in 2006 when the war started and the country was almost destroyed and the economy of Lebanon was almost destroyed. So there are a lot of constraints within Lebanon to an open war that Lebanon would start with Israel. How Israel is responding as well is very important. I don't think Israel wants to start or engage in a direct war.
Yeah. Well, I was there in 2006. I remember very clearly what it was like back then. Luciano Zaccara, professor at Qatar University and Georgetown University in Qatar. Thank you for joining us today. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. The U.S. has sanctioned 3 UAE-based companies and 11 vessels for shipping Iranian oil after the country said it was expanding its nuclear program. According to the State Department, the companies all serve as the commercial managers of vessels caught shipping Iranian oil despite U.S. sanctions. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. is taking action in response to continued nuclear escalations. And Bloomberg understands that Saudi Aramco is poised to buy a stake of about 10% in a joint venture with Renault and China's Geely. The 3 companies announced plans last year to make combustion engines and hybrid powertrains. The deal is set to value Horse Powertrain at around $7.9 billion. And Turkey's central bank has kept an interest rate pause, which has been in place since April. The Monetary Policy Committee left the one-week repo rate at 50% yesterday, in line with the forecasts of all economists surveyed by Bloomberg. The central bank signaled a hawkish path as it stays on alert for risks to inflation that just peaked above 75%. And coming up, it's business as usual in the EU as bloc leaders endorse Ursula von der Leyen for a second term. More on who got the top jobs next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. European Union leaders have nominated Ursula von der Leyen for a second term as president of the Commission. The deal includes the election of former Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa as head of the European Council. Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas would become the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. So for more on this, Bloomberg's Oliver Kirk joins me now from Brussels. So these 27 EU leaders have met in Brussels. I also noticed that President Zelensky was there. He made an appearance too. But it seems like those 3 top jobs have now been confirmed at a leader level. What happens next, Oliver?
Yeah, that's right. This was sort of the key and most important hurdle for so far to get these sort of top jobs allocated, because from those top jobs, all the other sort of commissioner roles, all that other stuff sort of emanates, and that comes as a consequence of that. And so, yes, we have an agreement, broadly speaking, among EU leaders to put those top 3 in those top jobs. What we were looking out for was trying to get full consensus among the biggest countries within the EU. That Jumana, we did not get. We had Giorgia Meloni, who abstained from endorsing Ursula von der Leyen. You had Viktor Orban, who voted against Ursula von der Leyen. And Meloni herself saying, I think that Italy needs to make its weight count. Italy will get what it deserves. So it was no secret that she was very displeased at sort of the top job process within the EU going into this. Now we leave it with Meloni dissatisfied. Really, the EU leaders really would have liked to get her on board, because the next step here, Jumana, is this needs to go to European Parliament, where Ursula von der Leyen only won last time by a record low 9 votes. And this is going to be an even more challenging tightrope for her to walk this time around.
I wonder if there's any possibility of her not getting through the next stage. So that could be a big question. Maybe it's too early to ask this question, Oliver, but when we talk about the future of European decision-making over the medium term, what many people are saying is, the last few years, the priority has been more spending, be it the initial response to COVID, and then, of course, the green spending initiatives. And I just wonder how, under new leadership, some of those spending plans are going to have to be dialed back.
Yeah, so listen, Jumana, this is a very sort of major question here. So I think one of the big differences from the last government coming into 2019, the Greens did very, very well. Climate was front and center. Since then, so much has changed, namely the invasion of Ukraine. And now it's very clear that defense is taking front and center. And in fact, Ursula von der Leyen, speaking last night, made this very clear. What she said is that the EU needs to spend €500 billion over the next 10 years in order to get their defense up. Part of this is also supporting Ukraine. What they did not agree upon yesterday, and this will be a very active debate, Jumana, which is basically precisely the question that you're asking, how do you pay for this, right? And the question of joint debt, particularly when it comes to spending for defense, is going to be a very active debate within the EU, particularly at a time when some of the greatest advocates for it, namely Emmanuel Macron, comes from a very weakened positions. And in fact, Germany and France both tried to get sort of more things into the strategic agenda. This was the sort of final omen. And all the other leaders said, you know what, no way, we're not going to let this happen, which just shows you how far Germany and France have fallen post that EU election, and really their popularity and potentially their mandate.
Yeah. Very good point. And then, Oliver, we have another big election coming up, the first round of the French elections on Sunday. Some of the local polls suggesting that there is a small chance that Le Pen's party actually gets an absolute majority.
Yeah, well, listen, if EU politics are a little bit complicated, so too are French elections. So there's a sort of 2-round process here. So it's maybe bears mentioning the mechanics here. So basically in the first round, if you get less than 12.5%, you're basically disqualified. You don't make it to the next round. If you get more than 50%, you then automatically win. So why it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen in the French election is because of that strange setup. What we get on Sunday is it's going to weed out a lot of different names from this sort of debate. So that's what we're going to be looking for. And again, it's going to be very difficult to sort of price this within the market. We've seen the bond spread sort of blow out. So really, it's an important moment here for France, and really will start to give some clarity in the shape of this next government.
Yeah, well, very busy couple of weeks coming up for Europeans, UK, and also in Brussels as well. So Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, thank you for bringing us the latest. Also coming up on the show, the rand continues to whipsaw after South Africa's 2 main coalition partners are already at loggerheads just weeks after agreeing to share power. We have the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. South Africa's rand led an index of peers lower on rising political risks after talks between the 2 biggest political parties on forming a cabinet stalled. Bloomberg understands that the ANC withdrew an offer to appoint a member of the smaller Democratic Alliance as trade and industry minister. For more, let's bring in our Africa correspondent, Jennifer Zabazaja. Jen, it all looked like it was going very well a week ago, but things seem to have turned a corner now. What are we hearing from the different parties on the matter?
Right, Jumana, and we should mention it's been about a month now since the election. So really a lot of investors, all of these parties were waiting for some sort of government to start forming. But yes, as you noted there has been a slight impasse. So what we understand is that the Democratic Alliance, which is the main opposition party, had asked for key parts of the ministry of the government, in particular, this trade and industry ministry. And this is important if we think about the issues that are key for this country to address. This is is a part of the economic cluster within the government. But our understanding is that the ANC potentially rescinded on that offer, on that agreement, whatever discussions were held, and instead offered the tourism industry, the tourism portfolio. Now, this is a concern for a few different reasons. Of course, we know that investors are waiting for this GNU to actually be formed, to actually accelerate some of the economic reforms that are pressing for them. But this whole government of national unity was made in order to bring together these different parties. And so now we're hearing the Democratic Alliance potentially being concerned that this is going to continue to lead to more instability. But for the ANC's part, Ramaphosa's part, he said actually that he accused the DA of moving the goalposts and said that he was taken aback by their own criticism. So it's a bit of a he said, she said at this point in time. But honestly, pressing for this government to form some sort of agreement quite soon.
Yeah. Jennifer, thank you so much for the latest from South Africa. Jennifer Zabazaja, our Africa correspondent. And do not miss Bloomberg's monthly special, that is Africa Amplified. Our next episode on Thursday, July 4th, will bring you top voices from the travel sector. And we are going to wrap up the show now. But quick look at markets before we head out. Things are leaning positive. That was it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersachi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.